In the dead of winter, when the bitter cold seemed unrelenting, Jacob Stoltzfus faced a challenge no one in Lancaster had yet considered. The ice was thick, but so was the skepticism of his neighbors. With no electricity or refrigeration, the Amish community's reliance on nature to preserve food was about to be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. Before we begin, share where you're watching from. And if the quiet strength of the Amish spirit resonates with you, join us for tomorrow's tale. The first snowflakes of the season had begun to fall on Jacob Stoltzfus's farm in Lancaster County. It wasn't an unexpected sight. The late November snowfalls had been coming earlier each year. But this winter, as Jacob had learned through the whispers of his neighbors, would bring a test of endurance beyond even what his people were used to. The harvest had been bountiful, the hay piled high, and the animals well fed. But food storage for the coming months? That was a different matter entirely. For generations, the Amish had relied on their ice houses to preserve meat, dairy, and other perishables throughout the long months of winter. It was an ancient method, passed down through word of mouth, born from necessity, and refined by time. Jacob had helped his father and uncles carry the heavy ice blocks from the frozen ponds near the farmhouse, each block carefully cut and hoisted onto the sled. His father had often said that ice was the key to keeping food fresh when the cold winds came howling down from the north. The ice house was a sanctuary of sorts, a humble fortress against decay. Jacob stood at the edge of the pond, watching as his eldest son, Eli, worked with a group of young men from the community to saw through the thick sheet of ice. The cold air burned his cheeks, but it was the kind of sharpness that carried a sense of clarity. The work was always hard, and the physical exhaustion kept their hands moving without thought. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this winter would be different. He had prepared for it. The ice house had been well constructed, reinforced, and well stocked with fresh hay. He'd done all he could, but there was one thing his community hadn't reckoned with: the severity of the coming winter storm. "It'll hold, Dad," Eli said, his breath forming in the freezing air. Jacob smiled at his son's confidence, but there was still a weight in his heart, a burden of foresight. The ice house was only part of the equation. It was what lay beyond that worried him: the food, the supplies, the people who would need help when the storm turned unforgiving. As the last ice block was pulled from the pond, the sleds creaked under their load. Jacob turned back toward the farmhouse, the wind tugging at his coat. The ice house would be filled to the brim by nightfall. But what if it wasn't enough? What if the harsh cold of the coming months rendered even the thick walls of his ice house insufficient? Jacob had always believed that nature's provisions could be trusted, but this year the earth felt more unpredictable than ever. The following morning, Jacob stood before the barn, looking over the ice house in the distance. The ice blocks sat within, stacked carefully in layers, insulated with straw to keep them from melting too quickly. But as he glanced toward the neighboring farms, he couldn't help but feel a sense of doubt. His neighbors had scoffed at his plan. "Why bother?" they had said, shaking their heads as they worked on their own farms. "A barn or a cellar will do just as well. No need for all that trouble with the ice." Even Eli's friends had raised their eyebrows at the project, but Jacob had worked the ice before, as a boy and later as a man. He knew its power to preserve. The skepticism was natural. Change came slowly to the Amish community. Their ways were simple, tried and true. The old ways had always worked, after all. But Jacob wasn't so sure. There were whispers of the storm's intensity, growing stronger with each passing week. It wasn't just a typical winter. Everyone was talking about it, and yet no one seemed willing to prepare for the worst. The ice house would be important, yes, but it was just a single piece of a much larger puzzle. Jacob's mind wandered back to the previous year, when one of his cousins, a farmer to the east, had lost half of his herd to the early snows. The ice had frozen quicker than they'd expected, and the animals hadn't been able to graze as long as they should have. But Jacob had learned from that loss. He had prepared for it, not just the ice house, but the supplies, the firewood, the stored grains. Still, doubts crept into his mind, especially when he saw the looks from his neighbors. They thought he was over-preparing. They thought he was wasting time. The neighbors continued to mock the effort, their voices carrying on the wind. Some even wondered aloud why he was building up stores of ice and meat when a storm would come and go, like all the others. They hadn't lived through a storm like this before, not one that lasted weeks, bringing temperatures that would freeze the ground itself. Jacob, however, understood. He understood that the things people took for granted, their trust in the warmth of the hearth and the provision of nature, could betray them when the world shifted. "We'll see," Jacob whispered to himself, brushing snow from the back of his coat. The world would always test the wisdom of the cautious, and the next few months would test the strength of his faith. By early December, the landscape had transformed into a blanket of white, and the winds of winter had begun their relentless howling. Jacob Stoltzfus stood by the window of his farmhouse, his breath fogging the glass as he looked out across the snowy field. The storm had arrived earlier than he had expected, and the wind seemed intent on making up for lost time. It howled through the bare trees, bending them low, and the cold seeped into every crack in the house. Eli was by his side, his small hands pressed against the window pane. "Dad, will the ice house hold up?" he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Jacob didn't answer immediately, his eyes tracing the falling snow. He had spent years preparing for winters like this one, each year reinforcing the foundation of his ice house, each year gathering more firewood than the last. But as the snow piled up, an unsettling feeling crept into his chest. "It will," Jacob said at last, though there was a hesitancy in his voice. He was a man of faith, a man who trusted in the land, but there was something in the air this winter that didn't feel right. He had lived through many storms, many winters, but none quite like this. This one felt more unforgiving, more relentless. As the days passed, the snow didn't relent. It piled higher and higher, and the temperatures plunged well below freezing. The ice house, standing firm against the elements, became a symbol of their preparedness, but Jacob couldn't shake the worry gnawing at him. The ice blocks inside were holding steady for now, but what of the food stored in the cellar? What of the animals? Would their provisions be enough to survive the storm's fury? He had spent the past few days hauling more firewood into the barn, stocking up on grain and salt for the cattle. His muscles ached from the constant labor, but the worry in his heart drove him forward. When the weather grew colder still, the cattle would need more feed. If the snow kept coming, the hay bales he'd stored would run out quicker than expected. One evening, after tending to the animals and making sure the fires inside the barn and house were still burning strong, Jacob took a moment to step outside. The wind stung his face as he walked toward the ice house, the snow crunching beneath his boots. He opened the door cautiously, peering inside. The ice was still intact, covered with straw and snow to insulate it. The meat and dairy were holding steady, just as they should. For now, they were safe. But what about the weeks to come? What about the supply of food, the resources they'd need to last through the winter's grip? And most of all, what would his neighbors do when their food began to run low, when they realized that their barns and root cellars weren't enough to keep them through the long winter? Eli appeared by his side, and Jacob gave him a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It'll be all right, Eli," he said, his voice soft. "We've done what we can." But in the depths of his heart, Jacob wasn't so sure. The storm was far from over, and his faith would soon be tested in ways he could never have imagined. As the weeks wore on, the snow showed no sign of stopping. The wind howled in the night, rattling the farmhouse windows and covering the land in an endless sheet of white. Jacob had never seen such a harsh winter. It was one thing to prepare for a cold season. It was another to live through one that seemed intent on breaking the spirit of those who endured it. The ice house remained a quiet refuge, but even it could not protect them from the other dangers that the storm had brought. The livestock had begun to feel the effects of the bitter cold. Hay was running low, and Jacob had to make daily trips to the barn, hauling extra feed and checking on the animals. Their once thriving herd had dwindled as the freezing winds took their toll. Even the most well-prepared animals struggled to survive under the weight of such an unforgiving winter. One morning, Jacob awoke to find a fresh layer of snow blanketing the ground. He could see from the window that the paths to the ice house and barn were nearly impassable. It wasn't just the snow, it was the sheer weight of the storm, the continued, biting winds that had worn the world down into something unrecognizable. He knew his neighbors were feeling it too. The old ways of survival, using the ice house, storing food, and relying on the land, were no longer enough. The families in the surrounding area had always worked together, helping one another in times of need. But the winter was different this year. People were running low on food, and their barns weren't built to withstand such deep cold for such a prolonged period. No one had ever anticipated this kind of storm, and with the trains cut off, supplies were dwindling fast. Jacob knew the time was coming when he would have to help, not just his own family, but his neighbors as well. There was no other choice. He took Eli by the hand one afternoon and walked with him through the snow toward the neighboring farm of William Crawford. Jacob had always considered Crawford a good man, though their ways often differed. Crawford had been the first to laugh when Jacob had mentioned his plans for the ice house, saying it was too much work for too little reward. Now Jacob wondered if Crawford would admit he was wrong. When they arrived, Crawford was standing by the door, looking out across the fields. His face was drawn, tired from the hard work of trying to keep his animals alive. "You've seen the storm, I'm sure," Crawford said, his voice heavy with concern. "We have," Jacob replied. "And we've done what we can. But if this continues, we'll need more than just food to survive. We'll need each other." Crawford nodded, his eyes distant. "I was wrong," he said quietly, "about the ice house, about your preparations." Jacob's heart ached with the weight of the harsh winter, but he didn't let it show. "It's not about being right," he said softly. "It's about doing what we can to survive. We'll get through this. Together." The cold was unrelenting, but as Jacob stood by Crawford's side, he knew that no storm, no matter how fierce, could break the bond of community. The work had only just begun, and the real challenge lay ahead. By mid-January, the storm showed no signs of relenting. The snowstorms had become an unceasing blanket that covered Lancaster County in a frozen, silent world. The air felt like sharp needles on bare skin, and the ground, frozen solid beneath layers of snow, made every step feel like a struggle. Jacob had never seen a winter this harsh, but still, his faith held strong. The ice house was well stocked, the food in the cellar carefully preserved, and his family kept warm beside the fire. But it wasn't just the warmth of the fire that mattered now. It was the warmth of the people. Jacob knew that the time had come. His neighbors, those who had mocked his preparations, were beginning to run low on food. Their barns, hastily constructed with less care than his, were struggling under the weight of the cold. The animals, once robust, now huddled in the straw, their breath misting in the frozen air. It wasn't just survival that was at stake anymore, it was the community. One evening, as Jacob sat in the dimly lit kitchen, his mind weighed down with the burden of what lay ahead, Eli entered the room. The boy had been helping with the firewood all day, but his brow furrowed with concern. "Dad," he said, looking up from the woodpile in the corner, "the neighbors, they're not doing well. Will they make it?" Jacob paused, his hand resting on the table, the weight of his years heavy in the silence. "We all will," he said softly, his voice firm despite the quiet worry. "But not alone. We'll need to help them, Eli. We help each other through this." Eli nodded gravely, his young face shadowed by the gravity of his father's words. Jacob stood and placed his hands on the boy's shoulders. "The harvests we made, the firewood we stored, the ice we harvested, these weren't just for us. This is how we survive, together." The next morning, Jacob saddled the horse, and he and Eli set out to visit the nearby farms. First, they went to William Crawford's place, where the barn stood covered in snow, its structure trembling against the relentless storm. Crawford's wife, Martha, was outside, struggling to haul feed to the animals, her face lit with relief when she saw Jacob. "Thank you, Jacob," she said quietly. "We've been trying to make it through, but it's harder every day. The cattle are growing weak, and we're running out of supplies." Jacob reached into his coat and pulled out a bundle of preserved meats, eggs, and a few bags of flour. "Take what we can spare. We'll be back tomorrow to check on the animals." Martha looked at the supplies gratefully, but there was a hesitation in her eyes. "You're not just helping us, are you?" "No," Jacob replied, his eyes steady. "This is for everyone. If you need more, come to us. We'll share what we have." Jacob and Eli continued their rounds, stopping at other farms, delivering food and firewood. By evening, the small acts of kindness had begun to ripple through the community. Word spread quickly that Jacob had opened his stores and was helping anyone in need. People came together, and the feeling of isolation began to lift. As Jacob sat beside the fire that evening, his family gathered around him. A warmth far greater than the hearth filled the room. The storm howled outside, but inside they had something even the cold couldn't touch. A community bound by love, faith, and the will to survive together. And in that moment Jacob realized that survival wasn't just about the ice house or the firewood. It was about the people who stood with you when the world felt cold and endless. By the time February rolled around, the snow had finally begun to subside, though it had left its mark on the land. The fields that had once been covered in rich brown soil were now deep under layers of snow and ice. But there was something different in the air. The storm had passed. The worst of it had ended, but the memory of the struggle remained, etched in the hearts of those who had lived through it. Jacob Stoltzfus sat outside, his hands resting on his knees as he watched Eli and the other young boys of the community play in the remaining snow. They had grown stronger, more resilient over the weeks, working side by side with their families to get through the worst winter any of them had seen. The ice house was nearly empty now, and though their food stores had been tested, they had survived. And in surviving, they had discovered something far more precious than just sustenance. They had rediscovered the power of faith, family, and community. Jacob's thoughts drifted back to the early days of the storm, when doubts had crept into his mind. He had questioned whether all his preparation had been enough, whether the ice house would hold, or if they would make it through the endless cold. But as the weeks wore on, he had seen something more important emerge from the storm. It wasn't just the survival of his own family that mattered, it was the survival of the entire community. A community that had come together, shared what they had, and helped one another in ways that words couldn't fully capture. Looking out at the landscape, Jacob saw that life had returned to the land, slowly but surely. The cattle, though weaker than before, were regaining their strength. The fields would thaw in time, and the crops would grow again. The ice house, though nearly empty, had done its job. And Jacob, though weary from the long months of toil, felt a quiet peace settle in his heart. Eli ran up to him, his cheeks flushed with the joy of the day's freedom. "Dad, I think I'm starting to understand what you meant," he said, his voice full of wonder. Jacob smiled at his son, his heart swelling with pride. "What do you mean, Eli? I thought the ice house was just for storing things. But it's more than that, is it? It's about taking care of what we've been given. It's about being ready for the hard times so we can get through them together." Jacob's eyes shone with unshed tears, and he pulled his son into an embrace. "That's exactly right, Eli. That's exactly right." As the sun set on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered fields, Jacob knew that this winter would be remembered as one of the hardest they had ever faced. But it would also be remembered as a time when the Amish spirit, steadfast, humble, and faithful, had shown its true strength, and as long as they held fast to their faith, to each other, and to the land, they would always find a way to endure. The storm had passed, but the lessons it had taught would last a lifetime. The cold winds had finally begun to soften in March, though the remnants of winter still clung to the land. The snow was melting slowly, seeping into the earth like a quiet promise that spring would come. But for Jacob Stoltzfus, there was no true relief yet. As the weather changed, so too did the work. The earth, once frozen, now demanded attention, and every day brought new tasks: repairing the fences, preparing the soil, and tending to the animals that had fought so hard to survive the brutal season. The ice house, now empty except for the remnants of straw and sawdust, had served its purpose. But the cost of surviving the winter had not been fully realized. The community, though stronger in spirit, was weaker in resources. The food stocks were dwindling, and the firewood piles had shrunk to less than half their original size. Jacob had shared what he could, but now there was a new challenge: rebuilding what had been lost. As the days grew longer, Jacob worked tirelessly. He was up before dawn and didn't rest until long after the evening stars had appeared in the sky. He checked on the animals, ensuring they were safe from the lingering cold, and then worked alongside his sons, clearing the fields and preparing them for the coming planting season. But no matter how much they worked, Jacob knew they could never make up for the sacrifices that had been made. The neighbors who had come to rely on Jacob's supplies were now struggling to gather their own. Many of them had lost livestock to the cold, while others were too exhausted from the winter to tend to their crops properly. The ground, though beginning to thaw, would not be kind to those who hadn't prepared in advance. One afternoon, Jacob stopped by William Crawford's farm. The man was sitting on his porch, looking out over the barren fields. His face was drawn, a look of exhaustion painted on his features. Jacob could see that Crawford was not the same man who had mocked him for his preparations months ago. "Jacob," Crawford said with a sigh, his voice rough, "I can't tell you how much I regret not listening to you. My barn is half gone, the cattle barely made it through, and now we're struggling to get anything started. I don't know how we'll recover." Jacob sat beside him, resting his elbows on his knees as he watched the wind stir the last remnants of snow. "We'll get through it," Jacob said quietly. "It'll take time, but we will." Crawford shook his head. "It's not just time, it's the cost of everything. The food we gave away, the work we didn't do. My neighbors, they've been struggling too. We're all paying the price for not being ready for what came." Jacob didn't respond right away. He knew Crawford was right. The price of resilience, of survival, wasn't just measured in firewood and food. It was measured in the strength of a community. It was about rebuilding from the ground up, about finding new ways to continue when all seemed lost. "I'll help you," Jacob finally said. "We'll help each other. It's not over yet. We can rebuild together." Crawford looked at him with a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. "Thank you, Jacob. You've done more for me than I deserve." Jacob nodded, his voice soft. "It's not about deserving, William. It's about surviving, together." As they stood up, ready to return to the work of the day, Jacob couldn't help but feel the weight of the winter's cost. But there was a flicker of hope within him, a quiet understanding that this hardship, this struggle, had forged something even stronger than the ice house or the firewood. It had forged a community. And that, he knew, was worth everything. By late April, the first signs of spring began to break through the lingering cold. The days were longer, and the sun, though still weak in the early hours, was starting to warm the earth. The snow had finally disappeared from the fields, and the once frozen soil was now soft and ready for planting. Jacob Stoltzfus stood at the edge of the field, his hands on his hips, surveying the land. His sons were already hard at work, preparing the soil for the first crops of the year. Eli, now stronger from the months of hard labor, moved with a determination that made Jacob proud. The last few months had been a trial, but the worst was behind them. The ice house, though emptied, had done its job. The firewood that had once seemed in endless supply had been used sparingly, and the grain from the harvest, though now low, had been rationed wisely. The community had weathered the storm, not just the winter storm, but the emotional storm that came with such a challenge. Jacob's faith in his neighbors, in the strength of their shared resolve, had been tested, but it had held firm. And now, as the earth began to warm, so too did their spirits. "I think we're going to make it, Dad," Eli said as he wiped sweat from his brow, looking out over the freshly plowed earth. Jacob smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Yes, Eli, I think we will." The first seeds were planted that afternoon, and Jacob felt the weight of the work begin to ease. The promise of new life, of crops to come, brought a sense of renewal that he hadn't felt in months. But more than that, it was the feeling of hope, the hope that had carried them through the winter, the hope that had kept them going when the future seemed uncertain. As they worked, Jacob noticed his neighbors slowly returning to their land. They had lost much, but they had gained something more important, a deeper understanding of what it meant to live in a community. There was no mocking now, no dismissive remarks about ice houses or extra firewood. There was only quiet respect and gratitude. In the evenings, when the work was done and the tired hands were finally still, Jacob would sit by the fire with his family. He would watch Eli and his younger siblings laughing together, their faces glowing with the light of the fire and the warmth of the season. It wasn't just the land that had come to life again. It was the people, the families, that had weathered the storm and had emerged stronger. Jacob realized that the true reward of the winter was not just surviving. It was the lessons learned in the hardest of times. The ice house had kept them fed, but it was the hearts of the people that had kept them alive. As the last of the frost melted away and the buds of spring began to bloom, Jacob Stoltzfus knew that the hard work of the winter had laid the foundation for something that could not be shaken. A family, a community, and a faith that would endure long after the storm had passed. The warmth of spring was now fully upon Lancaster County, and Jacob Stoltzfus found himself in a rare moment of quiet reflection. The field was alive with the sound of his children working, the soft hum of life beginning anew after a harsh winter. But as he walked along the edge of the newly tilled land, his mind often drifted back to the lessons learned through the hardship. It wasn't just the ice house or the food stores that had kept them alive. It had been their connection to each other, the way the community had come together when things looked bleak. Jacob had always believed that faith and hard work would sustain them, but this winter had proven that it was their collective spirit, their shared strength, that had made the difference. Eli, now a young man, joined him, wiping his brow as he came to stand beside his father. "Dad, you think we'll be ready for next winter?" he asked, his voice filled with determination. Jacob smiled, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. "We'll be ready," he said quietly. "But more importantly, we've learned how to be ready together." As they stood together looking over the land, Jacob realized that no matter what storms the future held, they had already faced the worst and come through it, stronger, wiser, and more united than ever. By the time fall arrived, the harvest had been bountiful. The work of the summer and spring months had paid off, and Jacob Stoltzfus watched proudly as his family gathered. The fruits of their labor. The corn stood tall, the fields were full, and the animals were thriving. But it wasn't just the crops that had flourished. It was the bonds of the community that had grown stronger through the struggles they had faced together. As the sun dipped low on a cool October evening, Jacob sat on the porch of his farmhouse, his heart filled with peace. He looked out across the land, where Eli and the younger children played, and he realized the true legacy of this past year wasn't in the survival of one family. It was in the survival of all of them together. The lessons learned, the faith tested and proven, the compassion shared during the hardest of times. These would live on long after the storm had passed. Eli joined him, sitting silently beside his father as they watched the horizon. "Dad, I think I understand now," Eli said softly. Jacob nodded, his voice filled with quiet pride. "We prepare for the worst, Eli, but it's how we face it, together, that makes all the difference." And as the cool autumn breeze whispered through the trees, Jacob Stoltzfus knew that the true strength of their community was built not on the ice or the food they had stored, but on the love, faith, and unity they shared, a legacy that would endure, no matter the season.